Every day this dog peered into a storm drain, and when it was finally opened, what people saw inside left them stunned. Stray dogs are common in many countries, but one dog in Turkey caught everyone's attention with his daily routine. This scruffy, dirty pup roamed the streets, scavenging for food and water wherever he could find it. On this particular day, like so many others, he trotted down the road, his tail wagging at anyone who glanced his way. Despite his rough life on the streets, he was a friendly dog who loved getting pets from passers-by. As he wandered down a familiar street, a delicious smell caught his attention. He followed his nose to a butcher's shop. Through the window, he watched customers buy big, juicy chops of meat for their dinners. His stomach growled loudly at the sight, reminding him of how hungry he was. Inside the shop, a young woman named Annie was paying for a couple of large steaks. After thanking the butcher, she stepped outside, heading home. Suddenly she heard a loud gurgle and a whimper. She turned around to see the stray dog looking back at her with sad, pleading eyes. His stomach growled again, and Annie immediately understood. This poor dog was starving. Feeling a pang of sympathy, Annie looked down at the steaks she had just bought. Without a second thought, she went back into the butcher's shop and asked for any cut-offs or bones that wouldn't be sold. The butcher happily obliged. Annie left the shop and scanned the street for the dog, soon spotting him watching her from a distance. She crouched down and gently held out the bone she had gotten for him. At first the dog was hesitant, not wanting to get too close. But as she continued to hold out the food, his hunger got the better of him, and he slowly crept closer to accept the meal. Finally, Annie managed to win the dog's trust. He wagged his tail and took the large bone from her. But instead of eating it on the spot, the dog picked it up and walked off, as if he had somewhere important to be. Annie was puzzled by his behavior, but decided not to overthink it and headed home. The next day, Annie was walking down the street and spotted the same stray dog. He noticed her too and came bounding up, tail wagging with joy. Annie couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm and gave him a quick fuss before heading off to her destination. She did, however, stop by a nearby shop to buy him some sausages. Once again, the dog didn't eat them right away. He walked off with them instead. Annie's curiosity about the dog's behavior grew, but her busy schedule prevented her from following him. On the third day, she found the stray waiting for her. She had started carrying treats in her bag, hoping to give them to him. Annie smiled as she approached, giving him the treats she had brought. This time, when the dog turned and walked away, Annie decided to follow. They eventually arrived at a busy street, and Annie watched as the dog made his way to a storm drain. He sat down next to it, peered inside, and dropped one of the treats into the drain before eating his own. Annie was baffled. What could be down there? For the next few days, Annie observed the dog sitting and staring into the storm drain. Each time she brought him treats, he would always drop half into the drain before eating his share. Annie's curiosity piqued, and she decided to investigate. She crept over to the storm drain, the dog standing guard beside it, but watching her with a curious expression. Annie peered down into the drain and gasped. She immediately reached for her phone and called the fire department. She knew she would need their help with what she had discovered. About half an hour later, a couple of firemen arrived and asked Annie what was wrong. She explained what she had seen, and the men quickly got to work. As they approached the storm drain, the stray dog began to growl at them. The firemen hesitated, unsure of how to proceed, but Annie knew just what to do. She gently walked up to the dog, reassuring him that the men were there to help. She held out a treat, and when he finally came to take it, she held on to him to keep him away from the drain. With the dog out of the way, the fireman pried open the storm drain. A crowd gathered around, curious to see what was happening. After a few tense minutes, one of the firemen reached into the drain and pulled out a tiny kitten. The onlookers gasped in surprise, but it didn't end there. The fireman reached back into the drain 4 more times, each time bringing up another kitten. Annie was stunned. She had suspected there was something down there, but she never imagined 5 tiny kittens trapped in the drain. As she held the dog, he wriggled free and bounded over to the fireman, wagging his tail and sniffing the kittens. The kittens mewed back at him. Annie approached the fireman and asked how the kittens could have ended up in such a predicament. They explained that the kittens were likely swept into the drain during a heavy rain. Remarkably, they weren't starving thanks to the stray dog's daily food offerings. Overwhelmed by the dog's selflessness, Annie knew what she had to do. She told the fireman she would take the kittens home and care for them until they were ready to be adopted. The fireman agreed and handed the kittens over to her. As Annie started to head home, she turned and called out to the stray dog. "Come on, Benny," she said with a smile. "It's time to go home." The dog happily bounded up to her. Annie cared for all the kittens and found loving homes for 4 of them once they were old enough. She kept one for herself, having grown too attached to part with all of them. And Benny, the shaggy hero, finally had a home to call his own. Annie had fallen in love with him and couldn't bear the thought of him living on the streets after his incredible act of kindness. The little family lived happily together. Neither Fudge the cat nor Benny ever had to worry about being on the streets again, as Annie loved them dearly, and they adored her in return. What an incredible story. Let me know what you thought in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated with more heartwarming tales.